Caroline Vale stood alone beneath the cathedral's stained glass windows while whispers slithered through the crowded hall like poisonous smoke. Hid smirks behind jeweled fans, elderly lords exchanged amused glances, and even the servants lining the aisle looked at her with pity. Everyone in the kingdom knew why the daughter of the ruined Vale family was standing at the altar beside Duke Adrian. It was not love, it was debt. Her father had died 3 months earlier, leaving behind gambling losses so enormous that creditors stripped the Vale estate room by room. Paintings vanished from the walls, horses disappeared from the stables, and servants who had cared for Caroline since childhood were dismissed without wages. The family name, once respected, became something spoken with ridicule during royal dinners. Caroline understood quickly that no one wanted a disgraced noblewoman with empty pockets and no influence. Then Duke Adrian offered salvation. The agreement had arrived in a sealed black envelope carried by one of his personal guards. Adrian would pay every debt attached to the Vale family. In return, Caroline would become his duchess and never interfere with his affairs. Her younger brother would keep the remaining land, her sister would continue attending school, and the creditors would disappear overnight. Caroline accepted before finishing the second page. Now she stood beside the most feared man in the kingdom. Adrian was 26, tall, broad-shouldered, and composed. Stories about him traveled farther than armies. Some claimed he had ended a rebellion by himself after negotiations failed. Others whispered that foreign ambassadors trembled whenever he entered a room. His expression rarely changed, his voice rarely rose, and no woman had ever remained close to him for long. When the priest announced their vows, Caroline forced herself to speak clearly despite the knot tightening in her chest. Adrian repeated his own promises without emotion, as though signing a contract instead of taking a wife. The ceremony ended beneath polite applause that carried no warmth whatsoever. As guests prepared to leave the cathedral, Adrian finally glanced at her directly. His gray eyes were sharp enough to cut through steel. "You will behave," he said quietly. Caroline swallowed, of course. "Do not embarrass me." The words settled heavily inside her, but she nodded anyway. Humiliation was easier to endure than watching her family starve. Manor dwarfed every estate Caroline had ever seen. Endless corridors stretched beneath glittering chandeliers, portraits of stern ancestors covered dark walls, and servants moved with mechanical precision whenever Adrian passed. Yet despite the luxury, the manor felt lifeless. No laughter echoed through the halls. Caroline tried desperately to belong there. She memorized the names of servants, studied noble etiquette late into the night, and learned Adrian's preferences from overheard conversations. She instructed cooks to prepare the meals he favored after military campaigns. She waited for him during late dinners that usually ended with untouched food growing cold beside flickering candles. Whenever he did appear, exhaustion shadowed his features. "You should sleep earlier," he remarked one evening while removing his gloves. Caroline managed a small smile. "I wanted to see you." "There is no reason to wait for me." He walked past her before she could answer. The loneliness inside Manor became unbearable during social gatherings. Cornered Caroline with poisoned politeness, criticizing her dresses while pretending admiration. Elderly duchesses questioned whether she understood proper court customs. Men who once bowed respectfully to the Vale family now barely acknowledged her presence. Adrian noticed the insults yet remained silent every time. Weeks passed and Caroline slowly realized something painful. Adrian did not hate her because of cruelty, he simply felt nothing for her at all. That understanding should have protected her heart, but it did not. One evening, while adjusting Adrian's collar before a royal banquet, Caroline gathered enough courage to speak honestly. "Did you ever want this marriage?" she asked softly. Adrian looked down at her hands resting against his coat. "Want has nothing to do with it." The answer lingered painfully throughout the journey to the palace. The royal winter gala overflowed with music, diamonds, and false smiles. Hundreds of nobles filled the enormous ballroom beneath golden lights, while musicians played elegant waltzes from the balcony above. Caroline remained close beside Adrian, careful not to make mistakes. Near midnight, a duchess named approached with several companions trailing behind her. "Lady," said sweetly, though mockery gleamed in her eyes, "how fortunate you are. Most women could never dream of marrying so far above their station." Caroline ignored the insult politely. "You are kind to say so." Stepped aside as servants passed carrying trays of wine. Then, with subtle precision, she extended her foot beneath Caroline's gown. Caroline stumbled instantly. A crystal glass slipped from her fingers, splashing dark wine across a silver dress. The ballroom fell silent for one terrible second before laughter erupted from every direction. Heat rushed into Caroline's face. "I am so sorry." Recoiled dramatically, "Careful, some stains never disappear." Caroline turned desperately toward Adrian, hopping for support, protection, anything. Instead, she found fury hardening his expression. "You're an embarrassment," he said coldly. The laughter stopped immediately. Adrian's gaze remained fixed on her, as though she had personally disgraced him before the entire kingdom. "Not a wife I could ever love." Caroline felt something inside her break apart. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. With trembling dignity, she lowered her eyes gracefully and walked from the ballroom before tears could fall. Rain hammered against the palace windows as she wandered through empty corridors searching for air. For months she had endured whispers, loneliness, and humiliation because she believed patience might soften Adrian's heart. She convinced herself every cold silence hid exhaustion rather than indifference. But standing alone beneath the stormy sky, Caroline understood the truth. No matter how hard she tried, Adrian would never love her. And that night, for the first time since their marriage began, she stopped hopping. After the royal gala, something inside Caroline changed completely. She no longer waited beside the dining table for Adrian to return home, no longer rehearsed conversations hoping for a single approving glance, and no longer searched his expression for warmth that had never existed. The humiliation he inflicted before the court had stripped away the last fragile illusion she carried into their marriage. Adrian did not want her love or companionship. He wanted obedience, silence, and distance. The following week settled into a colder routine. Adrian left before sunrise for council meetings and political negotiations, while Caroline wandered through manor with little purpose. Yet as she passed through servant corridors and storage rooms, she began noticing details she had overlooked before. Supplies meant for nearby villages disappeared from inventory records. Workers complained quietly about reduced wages. Several tenant families had abandoned farmland because taxes had doubled without warning. When Caroline questioned the estate steward, the older man dismissed her politely. His Grace handles financial matters personally. Caroline almost retreated. However, the frightened faces of villagers lingered in her thoughts. She remembered what it felt like watching creditors destroy her childhood home piece by piece. She could not ignore suffering simply because she lacked authority. At night, she began studying estate ledgers alone inside the library. The books confused her initially. Endless columns of figures blurred together beneath candlelight, and several servants snickered whenever they found her struggling through financial reports. Caroline ignored them. Each evening she returned to the library carrying determination. Slowly patterns emerged. Money allocated for road repairs vanished entirely. Grain shipments listed for poor villages never arrived. Taxes increased while workers' salaries shrank. Someone inside Manor was stealing from the duchy. Caroline gathered records carefully and visited villages without announcing her title. The conditions horrified her. Children wore shoes with broken soles during freezing rainstorms. Elderly farmers rationed bread because harvest profits vanished into taxes. Yet despite their hardship, villagers still bowed respectfully whenever they recognized her. "You came yourself," one elderly woman asked while Caroline distributed food from her carriage. Caroline smiled gently. A duchess should know how her people live. Word of Caroline's visit spread quickly throughout the duchy. At first, nobles mocked her efforts as meaningless charity from a desperate woman seeking attention. Caroline ignored them completely. She sold necklaces gathering dust inside vaults and used the money to reopen village kitchens. She hired tutors for orphan girls' education. She persuaded merchants to lower medicine prices by negotiating directly with them herself. Months passed before Adrian noticed anything unusual. One evening he returned unexpectedly early and found servants carrying crates of supplies through the manor courtyard. "What is all this?" he asked sharply. The servants exchanged nervous glances before one finally answered. "Her Grace ordered blankets delivered to the northern villages, Your Grace." Adrian frowned slightly. "Why?" The servant hesitated. "Because the children there were sleeping without heat." That night Adrian observed Caroline quietly across the dinner table. She looked thinner than before. Exhaustion shadowed her eyes, and ink stains darkened her fingertips from constant work with ledgers and correspondence. Yet despite obvious fatigue, she carried herself with calm confidence. "You have been busy lately," he remarked. Caroline folded her napkin carefully. The duchy needed attention. Something in her tone bothered him. There was no bitterness or trace of the timid woman who once waited desperately for scraps of affection. She sounded composed, distant, almost indifferent. Adrian discovered more changes over the following weeks. Villagers praised Caroline openly whenever he traveled through nearby towns. Children ran toward her carriage carrying handmade flowers. Servants smiled more freely whenever she entered a room. Even ministers within court circles had begun referring to her as the gentle duchess. One rainy afternoon, he entered the manor library searching for military documents and found Caroline asleep at a desk surrounded by ledgers. A candle burned low beside her hand while unfinished reports covered the table. Her gown sleeves were rolled carelessly to her elbows, exposing reddened skin from ink stains and cold weather. For the first time since their marriage, he studied her without annoyance clouding his judgment. Caroline looked exhausted beyond reason. Delicate shadows rested beneath her closed eyes, and one hand still clutched a pen even in sleep. A maid entered quietly carrying folded laundry. Her Grace has barely slept this month, she whispered before noticing Adrian's stare. She spends every night working. What? The maid looked confused by the question, because she says the duchy deserves better. Adrian said nothing afterward, but the answer followed him relentlessly. 2 weeks later, while returning from negotiations near the western border, Adrian's carriage was ambushed along a forest road. Armed attackers emerged from heavy rain with crossbows and hidden blades, striking his guards before disappearing into the trees. Adrian fought beside his men despite taking a deep wound across his ribs. By the time surviving soldiers brought him home, blood soaked through his uniform. Doctors rushed through manor as servants panicked across the halls. Fever spread quickly through Adrian's body, leaving him drifting between consciousness and delirium. Then another voice reached him softly through the darkness. "You need rest," Caroline whispered. Night after night she remained beside his bed while storms battered the manor windows. She changed his bandages herself when servants trembled at the sight of blood. She forced medicine past his lips whenever fever left him incoherent. Sometimes, during restless nightmares, Adrian felt slender fingers brushing damp hair from his forehead. "You do not have to carry everything alone anymore," she murmured one evening. Half conscious, Adrian opened his eyes weakly. Caroline sat beside him wearing the same wrinkled dress from the previous day, exhaustion evident in every movement. Yet when she noticed him awake, relief softened her tired expression with heartbreaking sincerity. For reasons Adrian could not understand deeply, that look unsettled him far more than pain ever had. Adrian feared losing Caroline's kindness for the very first time. After the attack near the border, Adrian recovered slowly, but the silence inside Manor no longer felt familiar to him. Every hallway reminded him of Caroline's quiet presence. While physicians ordered him to remain in bed, he found himself watching the doorway unconsciously, waiting for Caroline to appear with medicine or another exhausted smile. She continued caring for him without complaint, though the tenderness between them remained painfully one-sided. Caroline spoke politely, changed his bandages carefully, and ensured he followed the doctor's instructions, yet a distance lingered in her eyes that had never existed before. Adrian recognized it immediately. She no longer expected anything from him. One afternoon, while recovering beside the library windows, Adrian overheard servants speaking in the corridor. "Her Grace spent the entire morning at the orphan school again," one maid whispered admiringly. "She barely rests," another replied, "but she still smiles whenever the children run toward her." Before meeting Caroline, Adrian had believed kindness was weakness disguised as virtue. Yet despite humiliation, loneliness, and endless criticism, she continued giving pieces of herself to everyone around her. The contrast between them became impossible for him to ignore. As weeks passed, Adrian found excuses to remain near her. During dinners, he stayed longer instead of retreating immediately to his office. Sometimes he even accompanied her carriage through nearby villages under the pretense of inspecting estate conditions. The villagers welcomed Caroline warmly everywhere she went. Children clung to her skirts while elderly farmers thanked her with tears in their eyes. She listened patiently to every complaint and carried genuine concern for people society considered unimportant. Adrian observed quietly from a distance, disturbed by the growing admiration tightening inside his chest. One evening, while returning from a village meeting, rain began pouring heavily across the countryside. The carriage wheels struggled through mud before finally stopping beside the manor gates. Adrian stepped down first and offered Caroline his hand instinctively. She stared at it briefly before accepting with formal politeness. "Thank you, Your Grace. You used to call me Adrian." Caroline adjusted her soaked gloves carefully. "You once told me not to forget my place." Regret tightened around his throat instantly. Inside the manor, Adrian remained awake, replaying every cruel moment from their marriage. He remembered her hopeful expression during their wedding dinner and the devastating silence that followed his insults at the royal gala. Until now, he had buried himself beneath work and pride to avoid confronting the damage he caused. But guilt had become impossible to escape. Several days later, Adrian found Caroline standing alone in the manor gardens during another storm. Rain soaked her pale blue dress while cold wind tangled strands of hair across her face. "You will become ill standing here," Adrian said as he approached. Caroline looked toward the dark sky instead of him, perhaps. "That is not an answer." A faint smile crossed her lips, though sadness hollowed it immediately. "Does it matter?" The question struck harder than accusation. Adrian stepped closer carefully. Caroline. For months she had longed to hear softness in his voice. Now that it finally existed, exhaustion prevented her from trusting it. I spent a year trying to become someone worthy of your love, she admitted. Every day I wondered what I lacked. I thought if I worked harder or embarrassed you less, eventually you would look at me differently. But no matter what I did, you still treated me as though I ruined your life. Adrian felt shame crash through him because she was right. He had punished her for circumstances neither of them created. Caroline entered his life carrying kindness and loyalty, while he answered with coldness designed to keep everyone away. I was unfair to you, he said hoarsely. Caroline laughed softly without humor. Unfair. The single word carried more pain than anger ever could. For the first time in years, Adrian found himself unable to defend his actions. He wanted to explain the bitterness left behind by war and betrayal, yet none of it justified the wounds he inflicted upon someone innocent. Caroline finally turned toward him. Her eyes looked tired beyond measure. I am simply exhausted, Adrian. Then she walked back toward the manor, leaving him alone beneath the rain with regret clawing through his chest. 3 days later, Adrian returned from court to find official documents waiting on his desk. At first, he assumed they were political reports until he recognized Caroline's elegant handwriting near the bottom page. Separation papers. The room suddenly felt suffocating. Adrian read the documents twice before disbelief gave way to panic. Caroline requested no money beyond what legally belonged to her. She intended to leave quietly and settle in a small countryside estate owned by distant relatives. When he confronted her that evening, she remained calm. I thought this would make you happy, she said softly. You wish to leave. You made your feelings clear long ago. Adrian stared at her speechlessly. Until that moment, he had never truly considered life without Caroline inside the manor. Yet now the possibility opened before him like a nightmare. Without her laughter echoing through corridors, the estate would return to cold stone and empty silence. You cannot leave, he said finally. Caroline lowered her gaze. Why? Because I love you. The words nearly escaped him, but fear trapped them behind pride and uncertainty. Adrian had spent years mastering control over every emotion. Now, when honesty mattered most, he found himself helpless. That night he remained alone inside his office while memories tormented him relentlessly. Caroline waiting beside cold dinners. Caroline defending servants from cruel overseers. Caroline smiling weakly after he humiliated her before the entire court. Then another memory surfaced with devastating clarity. You're an embarrassment. Adrian closed his eyes painfully. The true embarrassment had never been Caroline. It had always been him. Before sunrise the next morning, a servant burst into Adrian's chambers breathlessly. Your Grace, the man stammered, Her Grace is leaving the estate. Adrian's heart stopped instantly. Adrian left his chambers without changing from his night clothes. Rain lashed against the manor windows while servants hurried after him in confusion, but he ignored every voice calling his name. By the time he reached the front courtyard, Caroline's carriage was already waiting near the gates. Caroline turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. She wore a simple traveling coat instead of expensive gowns, and the sight pierced Adrian unexpectedly. She looked exactly like the woman who had first entered Manor carrying nothing except sacrifice and wounded dignity. You are truly leaving, he said breathlessly. Caroline lowered her eyes. There is nothing left for me here. Adrian dismissed the servants with a sharp gesture. One by one they retreated toward the manor, leaving only rain and silence between husband and wife. Finally Adrian stepped closer. Do not go. Caroline stared at him in disbelief. Why? Adrian had faced battlefields without hesitation, but standing before Caroline left him feeling defenseless. You belong here, he said instead. A painful smile touched her lips. No, Adrian, I merely survived here. Those words shattered the final wall around his heart. Adrian moved forward abruptly and caught her wrist before she could turn away. Caroline froze instantly beneath his touch, yet his trembling hand revealed desperation impossible to disguise. I was wrong, he admitted. Rain streamed down his face, but he made no effort to move beneath shelter. I spent so long convincing myself that attachment was weakness, he continued. After war, betrayal becomes easier to trust than kindness. I thought if I kept everyone distant, nothing could hurt me again. Caroline's eyes softened slightly, though sadness remained there. And instead, Adrian whispered, I hurt you. The truth settled heavily between them. I punished you for my bitterness. I humiliated you when you deserved protection. You gave this manor warmth, and I answered with cruelty because I was too blind to understand what you meant to me. Caroline's composure finally cracked. Tears gathered slowly in her eyes. You told me you could never love me, she said weakly. Adrian stepped closer until barely inches remained between them. I lied to myself long before I lied to you. For the first time since their marriage began, Caroline saw genuine vulnerability in his expression. The cold duke feared by the kingdom had disappeared completely, leaving only a man terrified of losing the woman standing before him. You cared for me when I gave you nothing, Adrian continued hoarsely. You stayed beside my bed after I wounded you more deeply than any enemy ever could. You built life into this empty estate while I stood aside believing I deserved solitude. But if you leave now, Caroline, there will be nothing left inside these walls except regret. Tears slipped down Caroline's cheeks despite her efforts to stop them. Adrian reached upward instinctively, brushing them away with shaking fingers. Please stay, he whispered. The raw desperation in his voice broke the final piece of resistance inside her heart. Caroline had imagined countless times what it would feel like hearing Adrian ask her not to leave, yet now she saw not power or arrogance before her, but remorse and sincerity. Slowly she lifted her hand against his chest. You hurt me deeply, she admitted. As I know, I do not know if trust can return so easily. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, then allow me to spend the rest of my life earning it. Something fragile shifted between them then, delicate as glass yet impossibly precious. Caroline saw no deception in his expression. For the first time, Adrian looked at her not as obligation or burden, but as someone irreplaceable. When he kissed her, the world around them seemed to disappear. The kiss carried no cold restraint or distant politeness. It was desperate and aching, filled with every unspoken emotion buried between them since the beginning of their marriage. Caroline clutched his coat tightly as years of loneliness dissolved into tears against his chest. I love you, he whispered against her hair. The words healed wounds Caroline believed would never close. Months passed and Manor transformed alongside its duke. Adrian no longer buried himself endlessly in political affairs while ignoring his home. He ate dinner beside Caroline every evening regardless of unfinished work. He accompanied her during village visits and listened whenever she spoke about the needs of the duchy. At court gatherings, the change became impossible to ignore. During the spring royal banquet, a nobleman remarked that Duke had become softer since marriage. Years earlier, Adrian might have ignored the insult directed toward Caroline. Instead, he set down his wine glass calmly and answered before the ballroom. My wife is the finest person in this kingdom, he said coldly. Any honor attached to my name exists because of her compassion, not my reputation. Silence swept across the hall. No one will disrespect the Duchess of again. Caroline felt emotion tighten in her chest as Adrian offered his hand before the watching court. This time, when they stepped onto the ballroom floor together, he did not walk ahead of her. He remained beside her proudly through every dance. The years that followed brought peace neither of them had imagined possible. The orphan schools Caroline created expanded across the duchy. Farmers prospered beneath fairer laws she helped establish. Manor transformed from a cold fortress into a true home filled with warmth and children's laughter. One summer evening, Adrian stood beside the garden balcony watching Caroline chase their young daughter through blooming roses. Golden sunlight illuminated her laughter while their son tugged impatiently at her hand for attention. Caroline looked toward the balcony and smiled when she noticed him watching. Years ago, he had called her an embarrassment. Now he understood she had always been the greatest blessing of his life. Adrian left the balcony and walked toward his family, silently promising himself that Caroline would never again doubt how deeply she was loved with certainty.